So our perception of how much control we have on the company or security or stock that we are investing in, that makes a difference. Familiarity also makes a difference in our perception. If somebody has invested in a company or a stock earlier and made money, they feel that, oh, I know this so well, I can't lose money. And then they take more risk on that based on the previous experience that they have.
So Nimesh, let's talk about a very potent factor that grips the market quite often, which is fear. Can you throw some light on fear and how it plays out in your understanding of the subject?
So fear is a very, very strong emotion, and many a times it's very difficult to control and overcome. Let's take a case of 9/11. So on September 11, 2001, terrorists took control of 4 passenger aircrafts in the US, and they crashed them into the buildings, the World Trade Center and some of the other buildings. Due to this, it was quite a tragic event. There were 246 people in those planes, and they died because of this action. About 1,000 or 2,000 people died in the buildings that later collapsed. Now, this had a lot of political and geopolitical ramifications, this event. But if you see the economic side of it, the airline industry was very badly hit after this because people stopped traveling in airlines. They said it's very dangerous. For long holidays and long drives, people used to now go on the road by the car. Now, psychologists then studied the impact of this shift from people. They found that the number of fatal road accidents went up because of this shift from airlines to roads. And some of the psychologists who studied this phenomena, they said there were at least 1,600 more fatal accidents on the road post the 9/11 because people chose to avoid the airlines. And a lot of them have written about it, that many a times our perception of the risk is worse than what the calculated data shows. There were a couple of researchers who also said that we don't want to trivialize the tragedy of the 9/11 event, but if people keep shifting to roads, that they are putting themselves at more risk than flying with airlines. So fear is essentially the difference in our perception of the risk and what the actual data shows.
So Nimesh, you made a very interesting point, while answering my first question. You said that more than the objective assessment of the risk, it's the perception which drives fear rather than, calculating it and metricizing it. Can you throw some more light on what is perception versus objective calculation?
Let's take a very objective scientific way of calculating your risk. There are 2 parts to it. First is the value of the loss that you will suffer if something happens, and you multiply it by the probability of that event happening or that risk coming through. This is a very scientific way, a very objective way, but most people don't do that. And this is where a lot of biases also creep in. So let's take the first part, which is the value of a particular loss. Potential loss is 1 lakh rupees, financial loss of 1 lakh rupees. It differs in value from person to person, time to time, right? For some people, based on their experiences, memory, their net worth and all, that 1 lakh rupees may be a different value than somebody else. So biases come in when you put the value. The second part is probability of risk. Now, most of the time, you actually don't have the exact probability of what's going to occur as an event. So here, instead of people using certain defined probabilities, they use their own subjective probability, which is like a judgment. They use their own judgment. What is my chance of losing money here or there? There are also a lot of biases and creep in. So in both the parts of the equation, biases come in, which means people work or look at risk about how they feel about it rather than the actual calculation, and that makes a difference. Let's take equity markets, for example. There will be some people who will really fear a crash in the market. And for them, that perception is that you're going to lose a lot of money. Now, if you do an objective calculation, Jason Zweig, in his book, Your Money and Your Mind, he's put a very interesting observation that because of the vividness of the news of a crash, it comes into your mind very quickly. But you don't realize that if you don't invest in the equity markets and inflation keeps eating away your money, people don't realize that. So people fear a lot coming to equity markets or the fear of a crash, but they don't really perceive the same risk that inflation will eat away their wealth.
What are the biases that affect our perception of risk?
So there are many biases that tend to hit our perception and then our decision making about risk. Let's take the most common one, which is an availability bias. Availability heuristic is about what comes to your mind very readily. Now, typically vivid events, like we discussed in the previous question, they come to mind very quickly. Even if they are rare, they come to mind first. So we actually, mentally, we increase the probability of such events happening, though they are rare. And that affects our risk perception. So availability is one. Also, you would have seen in media also that many a times an event is so many times repeated and people being interviewed on that event. So that affects our perception about the probability of occurrence of such events, and that impacts our perception. The second important bias that affects is the perception of our control on the situation. As we collect more data, and we should, to collect more information and data about an investment or so, at some points, we become too overconfident about our control of the situation, that now I know everything. We actually reduce the probability of something going wrong, and we tend to take more risk there. So our perception of how much control we have on the company or security or stock that we are investing in, that makes a difference. Familiarity also makes a difference in our perception. If somebody has invested in a company or a stock earlier and made money, they feel that, oh, I know this so well, I can't lose money. And then they take more risk on that based on the previous experience that they have. Again, the perception of risk is different when things are more familiar to us. Some people prefer certainty and they don't like ambiguity. Unfortunately, when they come to the market, they find that things are more uncertain, complex, and they have to deal with these probabilities. So in that perception, what happens is people tend to overpay for what looks to them as a defensive bet. I'm ready to pay a very high valuation, even if I make less returns, because I perceive it to be defensive. It is more predictable. It is more certain. Now, you cannot really say that a particular business or a company is not risky or so, but that's a perception. We are overpaying just because it looks defensive to us. And lastly, also the crowd makes a difference, right? We perceive what the crowd is doing is right. We want to be with the crowd. If you're a contrarian, it takes a lot of effort because then your perception of risk is also very different when others are doing something else. So these are the main biases or areas where investors' perception of risk gets impacted, and the decision can be different from what they would otherwise do.
So lastly, Nimesh, as is the question that we typically ask once we discuss biases, how does one overcome this?
As I mentioned, that fear is a very strong emotion. It is very difficult to control. The human species actually survived because of fear, right? Our ancestors, if they didn't run away when they saw danger, then we wouldn't be here. So fear is difficult to control. However, a few things you can do. Let's split them into short-term and long-term things that one should do. In the short term, whenever you are in a situation which scares you, which makes you very fearful, gets you very worried, it is important to take a pause and step back. Maybe go for a walk. Stay away from your Bloomberg terminals or your screens for some time so that you can gather your thoughts, be a little more in control of your emotions. Talk to the right people. Speak to people who can help you calm down or assess the situation in the right manner. In a longer term, because fear affects our mind and body and has a very significant impact on our decisions, it is important that within your investment process, you put certain tools which help you nudge towards right decision making in those times, like putting certain pre-commitment. that
Okay.
will allow you or not allow you to act on a certain thing, or makes you want to pause and think about what you're doing. I had come across a very interesting example. I think it was by Richard Thaler, that he says when he writes an angry email, like, you're thinking that should be a software to stop me at that time.
Right.
And it should ask me after a couple of hours whether you really want to send
it to
that
others. Right.
email. So by that time, you are more in control of your emotions and are in a relatively less hot state to take the right decisions.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risk. Read all scheme related documents carefully.